So, first of all, welcome to all of you. I can't begin to put myself in the place of all of you as you have over the course of this past year experienced things that should not have to be experienced by anyone. We have a small taste of that because we have a grandson right now who's in the Air Force up in the edge of Lebanon, and a granddaughter who's actually now with us here. She had completed her military service a few years ago and then was called back in reserves and then was discharged and came to visit with us for a while. But it's not the same as the experience that you have on a day-to-day basis. And my wife and I returned. We were able to spend 6 weeks in Israel over this past summer, and got just a further taste of the pain of daily life and the struggle to maintain, particularly for children, to maintain a sense of security, a sense of hope, and the way in which people just work to achieve that and then see it crumble as someone close to them suffers some loss. At the time that the war broke out, we had 19 of either just two of our grandchildren, but 17, three of my brother's grandchildren, and 15 of my sister's grandchildren and in-law children who were in the tzava, and so we remain in contact with them, and we see the pain, but as I said, we don't live it day to day the way you do, and so I just need to acknowledge the gvura that Am Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael is manifesting at this moment in time, and that we join you in tefillot for shalom, of endless shalom ahead somehow. So what I would like to share with you is some elements of my own experience, both as a student and as a Rav. I had the zchut to study for, 4.5 years directly with Rabbi Ber Soloveitchik, Rabbi Dov Soloveitchik. And then in the subsequent periods of time, after my wife and I had spent 7 years as the Rav of the shul in Berkeley, and then moved to Boston. So we then spent 2 years in Boston, during which time I was able to renew an intimacy of contact with Rav Soloveitchik that was very important for me. And then subsequently, when I became chairman of the Department of Jewish Studies at Stern College in 1971, I had a substantial opportunity to remain in touch with Rav Soloveitchik. And I just want to share with you a few things that I learned from him that have been extraordinarily important for me, for myself, and for myself as myself, and for myself as a Rav of Kehilot, and as a teacher of Torah. So two things. One, I'll start with something that has now been published already and sort of verified in a number of different ways, although there were people at the outset who were reluctant to see it this way. In the early 1970s, I had a series of very extensive conversations with Rav Soloveitchik about the issues related to adoption. And in the course of my exploration of that issue, discovered the position of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Lubavitcher Rebbe had already by that time, published, and it was sort of well known, that he was opposed to adoption. Why he was opposed to adoption was fundamentally because he felt that it was impossible to live a normal family life under circumstances in which, when the male adopted child became 13 years of age, that it would no longer be permissible for his mother, his adoptive mother, to be in a state of yichud with him. And that when an adopted girl child would reach the age of 12, that she would not be able to be in a state of yichud with her father. So while the latter would be in Issa D'Rabbanan of Yichud, and the former would nevertheless be in Issa D'Oraisa of Yichud, the Yichud of Eishes Ishes in Issa D'Oraisa, and therefore the Lubavitcher Rebbe maintained that he does not see any possible way of people living normal lives that way, and therefore told people that they should not adopt. Rav Soloveitchik, on the other hand, when I asked Rav Soloveitchik about Lubavitcher Rebbe's position, and he sort of elaborated somewhat on his understanding of Lubavitcher Rebbe's position, and then indicated his own position. And in his own position, the Isur Yichud was not dependent upon the biological connection. The Isur Yichud was dependent upon the emotional and psychological connection, and that therefore, if a child was raised as the child of the identification of those two persons as mother and father, or whatever the gender of the child would be, that the Isur Yichud, the Isurim of Yichud, neither the Raisa nor the Rabbanon, would apply under those circumstances. And he had a variety of other elements that he wanted to share with me about this, and we had somewhat of a discussion about it. And then after he had finished portraying his own position and some of the makorot that he utilized to indicate that, including some passages in Tosefta related to orphan children being able to eat truma when they were in the home of being raised in the home of a kohen, even though they were not kohanim. He sort of stopped for a moment, and he said to me as follows. He said, so Rabbi Berman, after we got smicha, he insisted on calling us by our last names and with a title. So it didn't matter whether it was on the phone or in person. He always referred to his Talmidim to me, had given smicha as Rabbi so-and-so or Rabbi so-and-so. Which I did not learn from him to do in my relationship with younger Rabbanim, but in any case, he said, so Rabbi Berman, he said, what do you think the Lubavitcher Rebbe does when there's a family in his community whom he really feels ought to adopt? So I said, Rebbe, I can't imagine what he could do in that situation. I mean, I assume he would have to tell them, what his position is, and they would have to decide whether to adhere to his position or not. So he's sitting there, and as I'm talking, he's shaking his head no. And he said, no. He said, when he has such a situation, he sends them to me to pask in the shaila for them. Now, so what this manifested to me was something that I had understood from him before in a variety of other situations. In this particular situation, it had an enormous impact on me, because it made clear that the fact that you have a particular halachic position doesn't mean that that's the only possible halachic position that can be taken. And that even in a situation in which you believe strongly that your position is the correct halachic position, that you have to be able to acknowledge that there are others which others may view as at least equally as strong as yours, if not stronger, and that you have to be able to know when you have to step aside. You don't have to misrepresent your own position, but there are times when you have to be able to step aside and allow people's lives to proceed based on based on psakim that are not your own. One other sort of element in this regard. I'm sure many of you are aware that when people talk about the psakim of Rav Soloveitchik, that it is very often the case that people will tell you, oh, he paskined that way. No, he didn't really paskin that way. He had a different psak, right? And so everybody knows that, Rav Soloveitchik, at one point in time, told someone something about Kisui Rosh and told somebody else something else about Kisui Rosh, and all sorts of turmoil about, because he did not write his own Piskei Halacha. There are people by now who have written an enormous amount about the psakim of Rav Soloveitchik, but those were only the psakim that they heard. Hopefully they were only reporting psakim that they directly heard from him. But in any case, but nevertheless, the reality is that happens. And I just like you to understand, from my perspective at least, one of the major reasons that happens. And that is that Rav Soloveitchik's mode in dealing with his balabatim was very different from in dealing with people to whom he had given smicha, to other rabbanim. When he was dealing with balabatim, and I saw this sort of live in Boston in particular, when I had lots of balabatim, when I was rabbi at Young Israel of Brookline, who used to go to Rav Soloveitchik for Piskei Halacha, and so I knew what he would do and what he wouldn't do. And Rav Soloveitchik would, if a balabas, particularly if it was a balabas he knew, and they asked him a shaila, then he would give him an answer to the shaila. I mean, of course, if it involved some form of communal matter, he would not do that. I knew that already because as soon as I was elected the Rav at the Young Israel of Brookline, and my wife and I moved into Brookline, I went to meet with the Rav during the summer before I was to begin, and amongst other things, I asked him whether he would be willing to share with me his minhagei tefillah. And Rav Soloveitchik said to me, "Why? Why do you want to know that?" And I said, because you're the Rav of all of us in the community. And I would like to bring the minhagei tefillah of the Young Israel into conformity with your minhagim. Because I knew that there were a variety, already even at that point, knew that there were a variety of minhagei tefillah that he had at his minyan in Boston, in Brookline, at Maimonides school, that were quite different from the general minhagei tefillah, and I felt that it was appropriate to be able to shift the minhagim of the Young Israel to conformity with his minhagei tefillah. And he immediately said, "No, you can't do that," he said. Bisman hazeh, he said, every synagogue is its own makom for purposes of minhagei tefillah. And therefore it's your responsibility. I mean, minhagei tefillah, he said, can sometimes alter. They're not written on stone. But when they are to be altered, then you have to work with the balabatim to explain why you would want to alter that particular minhag, and win their consent, not simply tell them and not simply impose it upon them, and certainly not impose upon them minhagim that were developed in a different Beit Knesset, and for you to simply adopt all of a sudden for that Beit Knesset. So I was aware already, but on the other hand, when Rav Soloveitchik said, but he would, when Balavatim would ask him shaila, so he would offer them an answer to the shaila. On the other hand, when his Talmidim asked him a shaila, he did not do that. When his Talmidim asked the shaila, his first question was, "So tell me what you know about that." So we knew that we couldn't simply come to him and ask him a shaila, whether it was over the phone or in person. It didn't matter, because his first question to us was going to be, "So what do we know about this?" And so we would then, I and others would then describe to him, because we would do our homework. We knew we didn't want to be embarrassed by him. I mean, it was enough. There was one situation when I was in Berkeley, where I just did not have access to whatever it was I needed, and I called the Rav sort of in desperation about something, and he yelled at me for calling without having learned the sugya adequately. So I apologized to him, and I told him the circumstances I just couldn't at that moment in time, but I really needed an answer to the question. So he grudgingly really gave me an answer to the question. And in any case, but his usual mode was he would say, "Oh, so what do you know about that?" And he would expect us to provide an indication that we had learned through the sugya carefully and that we understood, what the makorot were in the Talmud and what the Rishonim had to say, and particularly what the position of the Rambam was and how the Rambam understood the sugya in the Gemara, and generally what the psak of the Shulchan Aruch was, and a couple of major achronim, and then after he heard us out about that, he would say, "So how do you want to paskin?
How do you want that?
How do you want to paskin?"
Okay.
Right? How do you want to paskin? And so I would tell him how I wanted to paskin. And there were three possible answers that he would give, and at various points in time I received one or the second or the third. There were some situations in which he said, I agree, which meant that he agreed la halacha. That would have been his psak halacha in that situation. There are other situations in which he said you can't paskin that way. You can't paskin that way could have meant two things. One was that I had made some error in my analysis, and it's simply not an acceptable psak, or that the circumstances, I had not thought through the circumstances carefully enough. You can ask me about this later if somebody wants to ask me about it. And there was a factor that I had not adequately taken into account, and that when I take that other factor into account, that the result was that I should not paskin the way in which I wanted to paskin. And then there were other situations in which the Rav would simply say, you can paskin that way. Now, you can paskin that way did not mean that that was his psak. You can paskin that way meant that he would not necessarily paskin that way, but he respected the fact that he trained us to paskin. He trained us to be rabbanim. He didn't train us to have a telephone number, right? He trained us to be able to research an issue in halacha and to arrive at a psak that is a correct psak. It didn't have to be his psak. But it had to be a correct psak. It had to be a reasonable, psak halacha. Now, I think, unfortunately, some of my colleagues did not necessarily make that kind of distinction. And that when the Rav would tell them, you can paskin that way, they then proceeded to tell, see, the Rav paskin that it's either mutar or asur in whichever direction it went. Because sometimes his own psak was more chamur than the one that the Rav wanted, the rabbi wanted a paskin, and sometimes it was more lakula, right? And you didn't necessarily know unless you then asked him what his own psak might have been in that situation, but he would not, in the situation which he was dealing with us, he wouldn't want to tell us what he would have paskin, because he wants us to assume, to live with the responsibility of a psak halacha that we had made. On the other hand, what it often did, unfortunately, is created an impression as to what the Rav's own psak was that was not necessarily consonant with his own psak halacha, and therefore there were some people who went around saying, yeah, the Rav told me this is absolutely mutter or this is absolutely asur, and there are other people who said the exact opposite of it, and it's important to know that when one hears the psakim of the Rav. For me, the importance of that was both in terms of again, this issue that there are often, not infrequently, but very often, alternative piskei halacha that are in fact possible, and that the responsibility of being a rav, the responsibility of having the authority to paskin, is that you have to be willing to bear the responsibility to do that. There are certainly many situations in which I did not feel sufficiently confident to do that myself, and I would not have publicly offered a psak halacha without consultation with him to confirm that was a legitimate psak halacha that I could, that I could make to people and that I could, do. But in the final event, I understood that it was my responsibility to make those decisions, and that those decisions had breadth to them. That it was not always the case that that even a consensus of achronim necessarily meant that you could not pask in a different direction in situations of substantial need.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
If you wanted to know what his psak,
yes.
you don't want him to that you think about what you're gonna לפסוק, יכלת לבקש ממנו את התשובה שלו? מה אתה היית רוצה? אני לפעמים רוצה, מה אתה היית רוצה?
At times he would allow for that, and at other times he would say, no, you have a psak halacha, you've already arrived at that conclusion, just do what you've said you want to do.
אני אחדד את השאלה, לפעמים יש גם מסורת של פסק הלכה, לפעמים יש דברים שמקובל או שפסקו ככה, ואתה רוצה לקבל לפעמים גם משהו שהיה בדור שלפניך ובדור שלפניו ובדור שלפניו איזשהו
but that's already taken account of, from his perspective, I believe, and from mine as well, that's already taken account of in the context of the analysis of the preceding literature on these issues. So I mean, if somebody hasn't done their homework and they're not aware that there's a that there's a consensus of psak on a particular issue, from the Rabbi Yehuda through the Chassam Sefer and then into the hands of...
יש הרבה דברים שהם בעל פה, שהם כאילו דברים שאתה יודע שנהגו ובבית של זה. ודווקא בבית של...
So...
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No, it was not... Now, the truth of the matter is, of course, that he had much greater... and had a much more flexible perspective related to matters of minhag, because the fundamental assumption that he worked with was that it's minhagei makom that are binding, and not minhagim of mishpacha.
Rabbi Berman, would you rather have the questions after you finish speaking, or it's okay?
It's okay.
Just let us know what you prefer.
It's okay for you to ask questions in the middle, and then when I want to go forward further, I'll go forward.
Great.
Yes. What's your name?
My name is Chaviva Speter.
Chaviva.
Yes. Could you give an example of a psak that you that you gave that was different from the one of the rabbi?
Yeah. All right. So I'll give you an example. There was a young woman we knew back in Berkeley who came from a non-Jewish background, and for reasons that were unclear even at the time, she developed an interest in Yahadut. I was a young rabbi, and I didn't have a lot of experience with this, but I knew that you have to discourage people, so I discouraged her in a variety of ways. But she was very persistent in terms of her learning, very persistent in beginning to change her lifestyle, and in beginning to observe mitzvot long before I would have even asked her to do so, after about 2 years or so, 2.5 years, I was willing to bring her before a Beit Din of Orthodox rabbis in Northern California at the time for conversion, and she converted. She was a graduate student in the sciences at the time. She was a very brilliant young woman, and she became part of our community. In the course of her graduate studies, she had come upon another, graduate student. This is after she's already converted. She came across, met a young man who, she developed a friendship with, the young man was interested in moving that relationship beyond the friendship, and she said she can't because he's not Jewish. And he said to her, well, what do I have to do to be Jewish? So she said, well, you have to either be converted, or your mother had to have been Jewish in order for you to be Jewish, born Jewish, but otherwise you have to have been converted. So he said, no, but my mother was Jewish. So she said, wait a second, what do you mean your mother was Jewish? We've been friends for a long time. You never mentioned that to me before, and I was certain that your mother is Protestant. You mentioned that your father was Jewish, but you never mentioned that your mother was Jewish. So I said, well, my mother died when I was about 3 months old. She was Jewish. My father, about 2 years later, remarried. His second wife was Protestant, was High Church Protestant, Presbyterian, and she insisted that she would marry him only if he agreed to raise me as a Presbyterian. So I was raised as a Presbyterian. So every now and then there would be some kind of a reference to the fact. He said, I eventually learned that my mother was Jewish, but it didn't matter. I was a Presbyterian. That's how I was raised. He said, so the religion that I gave up when I got into college was Presbyterian. That was not, but I haven't. But so she asked if he could verify that, if that could all be verified. In any case, it turned out that it could be verified, and they got married. I was inside the Kedushin at the wedding, and when he announced to his parents, to his father and his adoptive mother, that he was converting to Judaism, his mother disowned him. That's how opposed she was to his being Jewish. And his father told him that he better not come around. The parents lived in the Midwest. And he was sort of, broken by that, but he was in love with this young woman and he wanted to marry her. They got married, and he, in the course of this whole process, himself became completely frum. And then they both finished graduate school, and they got jobs, and eventually they moved to New York. So we knew them here in New York. And Baruch Hashem, they had 2 children, and everything was wonderful, except that their relationship began to deteriorate, and it led to divorce. And they contacted me and asked where they should go for divorce, and I told them that they should go to the Beis Din of America. The young man, meanwhile, was this man had begun to daven in a particular, shtibel in Manhattan, and the Rav there told him that he should go to the Agudas Harabanim. So he went to the Beis Din of Agudas Harabanim, and it's a very responsible Beis Din. An earlier period of time, my father, Zechat Tzaddik Livracha, was a member of the Beis Din of Agudas Harabanim. So he went to the Agudas Harabanim, and they wrote a get. And so, within about 2 years after that, this man got remarried. He remarried the daughter of a pask in one of the Chassidish communities here in New York. And started his family with her, started a new family with this woman. And then a number of years later, I got a call from him. I had not spoken to him for a number of years after their divorce. Gradually, sort of our relationship, withered. And I got a call from him, and he says he has a problem. I said, what's the problem? He said, well, my stepmother died. And my father was now alone. And so I flew out to visit him. And when I flew out to visit him, he, welcomed me. And I spent like a whole week with him. He wasn't sitting shiva really, but he, and in the course of the conversation with him, he said toward the end of the time that I was there, we finally got around to being able to talk about his Jewishness and the fact that his biological mother was, and so his father said to him, so I was also Jewish. I didn't do anything Jewish, but I knew that I was Jewish. In fact, he says, I'll bet you don't even know that I had a Hebrew name. So the man looked at his father and he said, yeah, I know what your Hebrew name was. Your name was Mordechai. So he said, no, he says, I assume you assume that because my English name sort of sounds something like that, but my Hebrew name was not Mordechai, my Hebrew name was Moshe. So he said, okay, so your Hebrew name was Moshe. In the back of his mind, he realized that he might have run into a problem here. And so he called me as soon as he got back, and he said, do I have a problem with my get and my marriage? So, in any case, it led to some further investigation of facts, and it turned out that, in fact, his father's Hebrew name had been Moshe. His father knew his Hebrew name. Nobody had called him Moshe for a long time, but that was his father's name. And so the question was his get not valid? And if his get was not valid, then what does he have to do about that? And what does that mean for the marriage? So related to the latter part of that, it's not that much of a second marriage. So related to the second marriage, it's not much of a problem. So if his get wasn't valid, so he would have to have a new kedushin. But the issue is, what about the first wife, right? Because she, in the interim, had not yet remarried. So in any case, I started doing the research on this, and it turns out that with some slight variations, certainly by far the most dominant position in this situation is that it would be considered Shemen Ishtakach. It would be considered a name that's I'm sorry. It's the passage of time. You forget things. The dominant position is that if the name was erroneous, if there was no name written, if there had been no name written, it would have been okay. But if the name that was written was in fact wrong, that the get was puzzle. And that it should then be necessary for him to write a new get.
Even though that's how the man has been known and was being called up to the Torah, let's say, as Ben Mordechai.
He was not being called up to the Torah. As he was being called up as Ben Mordechai, yeah.
And that doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't matter. That was not the father's real name.
Right.
It's a fact. I mean, a name is a fact.
Yeah.
So if the fact was wrong, then the get was possible. You need a new get. On the other hand, the Rambam maintains that that's not the case. The Rambam is not quite a das yochid on this, but it's definitely a minority position. The Rambam maintains that in that kind of a situation, that it's a it's, so to speak, a shemen ishtakach, and that the fact that that name is there is not does not invalidate the get. So I thought through. I mean, I sort of learned what I had to learn. It's not all of it is my fingertips anymore in terms of how the shitot very sort of spread out subsequently. But in any case, I eventually, decided I need to. I mean, there's an issue of validity of a get. I'm not going to, assume responsibility for issuing a psak in accordance with the minority position without getting, some consultation with the Rav on this matter. So I called him, and so he asked me, I went through the sugya, and he, and then he said, so how do you want to paskin? And I said that what I would like to do in this situation is paskin in accordance with the Rambam, that the get remains valid, because I said, first of all, the relationship with his prior wife is not that good, and all this will do is to exacerbate that relationship. And if I tell him that he has to have a chupin kiddushin again with his second wife, then his father-in-law, I suspect, is going to have a very difficult time with this, for it to have turned out that he allowed his daughter to marry a man who was actually still married to somebody else. And I think that it could create, sort of unnecessary conflict there as well. So I had told all of these facts to the Rav, except the question that you spotted instantly. And so he said to me, is his first wife remarried yet? So I said, no. So he said, then he has to write her a second get. He said, because if you paskin that, in accordance with the position, he says it's a possible psak, but if you paskin that way and they don't issue a new get, and she then remarries and has children, then someone is likely to come along later on in their lives and tell them that they're mamzerim because the get of the original marriage was pasul. And so you can't do that to her. You can't leave her in that position. So it was. So I met with the man, and I told him that that he has to go back to the Beis Din Harabanim again and tell him that he had made an error in his father's name, that he needs a new get, and that he needs a siddur kedushin for himself with his wife and a new ksuba.
למה צריך עוד קידושין? למה צריך עוד פעם קידושין? קידושין זה לא פוסל.
It does not pass. It doesn't affect the children. Won't affect the children at all. But it's not something that information that he was going to withhold from his wife. And if he was not going to withhold it from his wife, if he was in fact married at the time of the kedushin, it could definitely be a grounds for bittul kedushin on the basis of tos.